Alexander this morning talked about the First World War, and that war broke out, what, 108 years ago almost now? And throughout the world, from Turkey to Austria, from Hungary to London, from Berlin to Rome, uh, to Paris, everywhere, millions of people cheered on the onset of war. Everywhere they marched enthusiastically on behalf of their flag. Everywhere, the Catholic priests and Protestant ministers of every denomination blessed their armies and blessed their flags. And the result was 20 million people slaughtered in 4 years. And in some of these countries, there were individuals in Britain, in Russia, in Germany, in the United States, on all sides, who said, "This is madness. Why are we slaughtering each other? Why are we sending our young people to murder and to die?" And in every one of these countries, those few people that said that were jailed as traitors and criminals. So when we look at the world today, I think it behooves us to ask ourselves, well, what is it that allows some people to think for themselves and to be able to stand apart from the herd and to actually speak up in the face of popular disdain and even hatred, and even at the risk of their own freedom? And that something that allows them to do that surely is the capacity to be honest to themselves, to be true to themselves, to be themselves. And that thing of being ourselves, or that process of being ourselves, being truly ourselves, meaning that we know what our values are, trusting ourselves, and not being intimidated by how alone we might be in that assertion of our true selves. That's a very rare quantity. It's a very rare quality. It's very difficult to attain. Let me give you a personal story. When I was about 20, I was far from knowing myself. I mean, I was far away from knowing myself as I could possibly have been. And I had an aunt who had come back from Auschwitz, and she was an ophthalmologist. And she could see me very clearly. She could see my inauthenticity very clearly. And she sent me a letter once when I was 20, and she said, and she quoted Shakespeare. She quoted Polonius, the character from the play Hamlet, who very famously said, "To thine own self be true, and then it follows this night today that you can't be false to any man." Now, there's a double irony in the story I've just told you, because Polonius himself is a very false character. He's a buffoon, he's a toady, he's a spy, he's a abject courtier, but he speaks this absolute truth. My aunt, who sent me that quote, I found out only after her death that she's been a closeted lesbian all her life. So she lived a completely inauthentic life. I'm not blaming the poor woman, how she must have suffered. And in the world of those days, particularly in Eastern Europe, you just could not be a lesbian. But so here's my aunt, who all her life was forced to betray herself, quoting to me this character who himself was utterly inauthentic, these very beautiful words about authenticity, about being true to ourselves. That, people, is how difficult it is. That's how difficult it is. And certainly my journey, um, if it's involved anything, it's involved stepping into myself as best I could. And it's an ongoing process. And sometimes when people come up to me and they tell me how much my work has meant to them, and thank you, your books changed my life. And my response is, gee, maybe I should read it myself, because I'm far from I'm far from embodying all the stuff that I talk about in my daily life. So it's a difficult process, but I think it's a well, I don't think it's an absolutely essential one. And the surrender of authenticity, the surrender of who we actually are, exacts a heavy price. Let me read you a couple of quotes from my new book. This is the singer and songwriter and musical megastar Sheryl Crow, who had, as you may have heard, she had breast cancer. And here's what she learned through her cancer. She says, surviving breast cancer redefined who I am and how I am. Until then, I'd spent a lifetime being a caretaker for everyone around me. From then, I started to put myself first. I had voices at the back of my head telling me that whatever I did wasn't good enough. Now I have finally silenced them, she said. Now, I don't recommend getting disease as a teacher, but it often is. And I'll quote you somebody else. This is another woman who's quite famous. Her name is Anita Morjani, and Anita is now 60, 61 years old. When she was 41, she had terminal lymphoma. She was in the ICU. She heard the doctors telling her husband that she's only got her organs were shutting down. And she heard the doctors telling her that she only had a few days to live. And then she had her near death experience where she actually saw her whole life. She wrote a book called Dying to Be Me. Now, get the meaning of that sentence dying to me. She literally had to nearly die to become herself. The terminal lymphoma that's supposed to have killed her 20 years ago, long gone. And she's here, very vibrant and active and a very lovely personality. And she told me that the person I was before I got cancer was afraid of disappointing other people. I was a pleaser. I completely lost myself in satisfying other people. I became so drained. I was someone who could not say no. I was a rescuer, and I would be the one who was there for everyone. I didn't even learn that it's okay to be me when I had cancer. It took being in a coma to learn that, because she was in a coma where she had her near death experience. So, this flight from the self, we're not talking about some new age, airy fairy concept here. Um, we're talking about something very practical. And the flight from the self, where people allow themselves, unwittingly perhaps, to be manipulated into wars, into beliefs, into loyalties that don't serve them. That dominates our world. I mean, how many people actually want the earth to be destroyed? Even the oil company executives don't want it to be destroyed. They just don't care if it is for the sake of profit. But how many people actually want it? How many people really want wars to go on? And yet, as we all know all too well, wars do go on. And by the way, not just in Eastern Europe, but elsewhere as well, exacting terrible death toll. It's not because anybody wants it. Not most people, but most people are hypnotized into passivity in the face of all that. They're so divorced from their own selves that even seeing horrible things happen to their loved ones or to the earth doesn't shake people out of their lethargy. Well, what accounts for that? How does that happen? As a infant survivor of the Nazi genocide in Eastern Europe, I grew up with this question: and how can people suffer so much, and how can they make other people suffer so much? I had to laugh when Wade was talking about his experience of God as a young child because I figured in Eastern Europe, in communist Eastern Europe, I grew up in Hungary. There used to be a joke about which said that you could be honest or intelligent or a member of the Communist Party. As a matter of fact, you could be any two of those three things, but not all three at the same time. Now, I had the same take on God when I was a kid. God could be omniscient. He, she, they could know everything. They could be omnipotent and all good. In fact, any two of those three things, but not all three at the same time. They couldn't be good, all knowing, and all powerful. Because if they were all powerful, they were not good. So that was my child's logic. And that actually was logically completely right. But it's for a long time, it's separated from the sacred that we just heard Ray talk about. So what is it then that even awakens people to the necessity to seek authenticity, to seek their true selves? Well, usually there's three types of wake up calls. There's failure. You just keep failing, and at some point you have to keep asking yourself, is it me, or is it I'm just unlucky, or am I doing something wrong? And then you have to start asking questions. But a much more devastating teacher is success, because as long as you're failing, you can still believe, well, if I only succeeded, then I'd be happy and I'd be fulfilled and I'd be grounded and I'd be who I needed to be. But when success happens and you still don't feel fulfilled, and you still don't feel that you've arrived anywhere, and you still don't feel that you belong, and you still don't feel that you know yourself, that's a powerful wake up call. I was in my 40s, and by all standards of the world, I was successful. I was a physician, I had a well paying, remunerative employment. I was married, I had children, nice home, and I was really unhappy, depressed as a matter of fact, and convinced that I was nowhere near my potential. But when I heard Alexander talk this morning, talking about purpose, I had no idea what my purpose was. I had no idea what my purpose was at all. So success can be a powerful wake up call. I bet, looking at this fairly well heeled audience that I'm addressing at the moment, I'm sure some of you know what I'm talking about. You've achieved a fair degree of success in your worldly endeavors and you're still looking for yourself. And the third kind of wake up call is usually some kind of a crisis. Now, the Greek playwright Aeschylus, in his play The Agamemnon, he said that the way the Zeus, the god, created us, human beings, is that we have to suffer into the truth. And just as Anita Majani and Sheryl Crow had to suffer into the truth, so do many of us. So some kind of a crisis. That crisis could be disease. And I'm telling you, I don't recommend it, but I've seen it function as a very powerful wake up call to people to seek themselves. I'll say more about that in a little while. It could also be some life challenge like a divorce, a broken relationship. Um, it can be just your ordinary run of the mill midlife crisis. The world's most famous example of midlife crisis is Dante Alighieri, the great medieval Italian poet, who begins his Inferno, the first three books of his Divine Comedy, with the line, midway through life's way, I lost my path. And I don't know how I ended up in that dark forest. So he actually begins with a midlife crisis. And he realizes he doesn't know himself, he doesn't know his potential, he doesn't know the sacred. And the Divine Comedy has three books. There's Inferno, which is hell. Then there's Purgatorio, which is purgatory, where you get cleansed. And then there's Paradiso, paradise, heaven. He doesn't go straight to heaven, does he? Where does he have to go? He has to go through hell first. He has to go through all the layers of suffering that the psyche is capable of. And he has to get to know them. And he has to get past them. And so, what I'm suggesting to you is that authenticity and becoming ourselves is not simply a pious wish, nor is it a question of positive affirmations. Today, I'm going to be true to myself. Well, I could tell myself that till the cows come home, but it wouldn't get me one step closer to myself. You have to go through the stuff, the difficult, dark stuff. That's how you get to know yourself. Which then brings up the very question of how do we lose ourselves in the first place? And why do we lose ourselves? Well, one reason is very obvious, and Wade actually alluded to it. I just finished reading a novel by a British Columbia indigenous writer called Richard Wagamese. In this, he talks about the horrific experience of of the residential schools. Now, just 2 months ago, I was in ceremony with a group of indigenous leaders. It was a mushroom, a psilocybin ceremony, and the sorrow, the grief that these people hold, it's unbelievable. But what's also unbelievable is their connection to nature, their connection to spirit, to the sacred, their dignity, their love, and their welcoming spirit. It was an extraordinary experience. And one of those people that was there was about to travel to Italy to meet with the Pope. A group of indigenous leaders traveled to Italy so the Pope could apologize for what the church did to their children for over 100 years. The punishment for being authentic for a native child, and there's nothing more authentic than speaking your own language. The punishment for being authentic for a 4-year-old child that I know, she's in her 60s now. She was an alcoholic by the time she was 9 years old. First day in residential school in British Columbia when I was in my teens and I had no idea this was going on. She spoke her native language. The teacher stuck a pin through her tongue. And for a whole hour, this little girl sat there, unable to put her tongue back in her mouth because she would cut her lips. And that's before the sexual abuse began. That was the price they had to pay for being themselves. And so in this book, the chief character, the leading character says, um, I discovered that being someone you are not is often easier than living with the person you are. So for him and for many others, that flight from the self is simply a survival technique. When being yourself exacts more pain and presents more danger than becoming someone else. No, horrific is the experiences that his people suffered and that he depicts in his book. That experience of having to give up who you are for the sake of avoiding more suffering is very common. In fact, I would say it affects more people. Not in such a dramatic and horrendous way, but it does anyway, for a very simple reason. Um, and before I go there, let me just read you a few examples of what I'm talking about. So I had this fascination with obituaries, and the reason is because they tell a lot about people. And just as with Anita Morjani and Sheryl Crow, that flight from the self, that suppression of the real self, is actually a source of physiological disease, uh, documentably so. I'm not going to go into the physiology of it for you, but the science is fairly clear why should that should be the case. It simply has to do with the mind-body unity. You can't separate the mind from the body. In fact, even to say that they're connected is false because that implies that two separate entities are connected. They're not connected, they're the same thing. They're not exactly the same thing, but they're one unit. And a really a brilliant American researcher called it body mind. So I read the newspaper for these articles. The first one is not an obituary. The first one is written by a woman who's just been diagnosed with breast cancer. And this is her first person story from a Canadian newspaper. Her doctor's name is Harold, and her husband's name is High. And High's first wife died of breast cancer, and now Donna, the second wife, is diagnosed with the same condition. And she writes, this is her first person account, and she has no idea what she's saying. Harold tells me that the lump is small, and most assuredly not in my lymph nodes, unlike that of Heist's first wife, whose cancer had spread everywhere by the time they found it. You're not going to die, he reassures me. But I'm worried about High, I say. I won't have the strength to support him. Now, what's wrong with this picture? Now, she's the one that's going to have to go through chemotherapy, perhaps radiation surgery, and her first thought is, how will I support my husband? Now, that automatic concern for the needs of others, ignoring one's own, is number one, a sign of the flight from the authentic self. And number two, it's a significant source of physiological pathology. The others are obituaries, and obituaries are interesting because they tell you about what we value in each other. And there's the expression in English that the good die young. Well, actually, often that's true. And the reason they die is because they are too good in a certain sense, because their goodness represents not authentic compassion, empathy, and wisdom. It represents a flight from the self. They're afraid not to be good, is what it is. So this man is a physician. He died at age 55 of cancer, and the obituary said, never for a day did he contemplate giving up the work he so loved at Sick Children's Hospital. He carried on with his duties throughout his year-long battle with cancer, stopping only a few days before he died. Now, what would you tell a friend of yours? Just forget about it. Go back to work and don't think for a minute about what your needs might be. That rigid identification with duty, role, and responsibility rather than the needs of the authentic self is a major risk factor for illness, both of body and mind. And I can totally relate to it. I mean, in my days as a workaholic doctor, I never said no to anything. My identity was was totally hinged on my work, and identity is an interesting word because it's from two Latin words, idem, which means the same, and facere, which means to make. So when you make yourself the same as your duty, role, and responsibility, you disappear as a human being with your own emotions and your own truths. You just become that thing that you do. Major risk factor for pathology. The third obituary is really telling because it celebrates people who are super nice. And people who are super nice, I always worry about them because I can see the writing on the wall. This is the husband writing appreciatively of his wife. In her entire life, she never got into a fight with anyone. The worst she could say was fooey or something else along those lines. She had no ego. She just blended in with the environment in an unassuming manner. What is being described here is the absence of healthy anger. Now, those of you who are in relationships like I am, 55 years now in this relationship, I'm sure that you wished, as like I did, that your partner would blend in with the environment in an unassuming manner. But if you're lucky, they didn't do that because they wanted to stay healthy. Because that suppression of healthy anger is a major blow to the immune system for very obvious physiological reasons. And actually, how God created us, how our nature evolved us, we have a system in our brain for rage. We actually have an anger system in our brain. It's there for a good reason. When we're suppressing anger, healthy anger, I'm talking about, we're suppressing part of our natural defense. And that also suppresses the immune system, which is another part of our natural defense. The final one I'll read you is about a physician who died at age 72 of a malignancy. His name was Sidney, and you have to just take my word for it that I'm not making this one up. The obituary said, with deep appreciation, celebrating what killed the guy. The obituary said Sidney and his mother had an incredibly special relationship, a bond that was apparent in all aspects of their lives until her death. As a married man with young children, Sidney made a point to have dinner with his parents every day, as his wife Rosalind and their four kids waited for him at home. He would walk in, greeted by yet another dinner to eat and to enjoy. Never wanting to disappoint either woman in his life, Sidney kept eating two dinners a day for years until gradual weight gain began to raise suspicions. So this man suffered from two fatal beliefs, and when I say fatal, I'm being very specific. He believed, number one, that he is responsible for how other people feel. Number two, he believed that he must never disappoint anybody. You want to get sick? Believe those things. Now, again, I'm not going to go into the science of it today, but you have to take my word for it that these personality traits are a significant risk factor for illness, and I see them over and over again in autoimmune disease, such as rheumatoid arthritis or multiple sclerosis, colitis, Crohn's disease, psoriasis, um, multiple sclerosis, any number of physical illnesses. I see them all over the place, universally actually, and uniformly so, because they undermine the physiology of the body through a whole lot of mechanisms. Are we saying, though, that we're blaming the patient for their illness? We're not, because nobody does these things deliberately. They're second nature, but they're not first nature. Think of that phrase, it's my second nature. Well, that implies that there's a first nature that somehow you forgot about. So this is people's second nature. How does it get to be that way? Well, for a really good reason. Because the human child, I'll talk to you if I have time about the authentic needs of the child. But one of them, and the chief one, in fact, the ground of them all, is the attachment relationship with the parents. That attachment relationship, which makes the child cling to the parent and makes the parent cling to the child. Without that, there's simply no survival for any mammalian creature or even for any avian creature. So that there's a powerful attachment drive. Just like there's a drive for anger, we also have a drive for attachment, physiologically built into our brains through particular brain circuits, brain chemicals, and so on. So we have that need to attach, and it's obvious why, because the human infant is the most helpless, the most dependent, the least mature of any creature in the universe, and their needs include not only physical taking care of, as we now know, but also being emotionally connected, emotionally held, emotionally seen, emotionally heard. That's just an absolute need of the child. But the attachment relationship is not negotiable. So that's one need that we have. Now we have another need, which I've been talking about, authenticity, to be ourselves. And again, I'm not talking about some kind of new age concept. I'm talking about our capacity to feel what we feel and to be able to act, to heed what we feel and to be able to act on it. Now, why is that a need? Because, as we heard today already, until very recently in human evolution, we lived in small band hunter gatherer groups. And even our species, which has been around perhaps for 150, 200,000 years, if our own species' existence can be measured over a span of an hour, then we have not lived as hunter gatherers for the last 6 minutes. When you add in hundreds of thousands of years of pre-Homo sapiens sapiens, human evolution, our hominin ancestors, for millions and hundreds of thousands of years, that's how we lived out there in nature. But just how long do you survive out there in nature if you're not in touch with your gut feelings? That's how important authenticity is. And even you, who don't live out there in nature for the most part, will be able to verify this. Because let me ask you a following question and I'll ask for a show of hands. Raise your hand if you've ever had the experience of having a strong gut feeling about something, not listening to it, and being sorry afterwards. Just put your hand if you've had that experience. That's how important that is. Let's start the other way around. Raise your hand if you think you had a powerful gut feeling didn't listen to it, and you were glad afterwards? Now raise your hand. Nobody. Okay? That's how important authenticity is. So far, so good. We've got these two needs: attachment, authenticity. But what if the two come into conflict? What if, in order to be authentic, as in the case of the native child in the residential school, you're going to be punished, or you will lose your attachment relationships? What if your parents read one of these stupid books by pediatricians and child rearing experts telling you that the way you raise an infant is you sleep them to train you train them to sleep by ignoring their crying? Well, that kid will, after a couple of days, go back to sleep because he can't stand the pain of not being picked up, which is the actual physiological need of his. And because it's too painful, he'll separate from his feelings and he'll go back to sleep. Lots of parents are still told to raise their kids that way. If you read the mega selling Canadian psychologist, Jordan Peterson, about whom I could speak volumes, but I'll contain myself. Uh, he tells parents that an angry child should be made to sit by themselves until they come back to what he calls normal. In other words, anger in a child is not normal, right? And the child needs to be told that, needs to be given the message: you're not acceptable to us when you have that emotion. Your attachment relationship is going to be withdrawn from you. You're going to be by yourself. Well, what will the child do? The child will suppress the anger. And the problem with these childhood adaptations is that they're not conscious, they're not deliberate. I mean, if you live in a cold climate, you adapt by putting on warm clothing, but you don't wear it in the summertime, otherwise it'll kill you. I mean, in British Columbia, up the north, where Wade was talking about, if you wear the same clothing in the summertime as you did in the winter, you're going to die. So those adaptations that we consciously take on, we can let go of. But those adaptations that we absorb as young children and infants in response to the demands of the environment, we're not conscious of. They become who we think we are. They become part of our personality. And then we think we're the personality. And then we act from that personality until disease or some crisis comes along to wake us up. So that um, many of the character traits that you might recognize about yourself and you might even be proud of actually came along as adaptations to help you survive your environment. So, for example, if as a child you were not given the attention that you needed just for who you were, you're going to be consumed by becoming attractive. So, you're going to attract attention. And now you have the $50 billion cosmetic surgery industry because people are so desperate to be attractive. And we all want to be attracting attention by whatever means we've got, physically, through our personalities, through our accomplishments, through our smarts. And that becomes a personality. What an attractive personality. If we didn't get if we didn't get the approval that we needed just for who we were, then we become consumed by the need to win approval, and then we become a winning personality, and everybody thinks we're so great, and we think we're so great, but there's something hollow about it when you go home and you're by yourself at night. If we didn't get the attention that we needed, or if we were, I should say, if we weren't valued for who we were, then we'll become consumed by measuring up, by proving our worth. I talked about my own workaholism as a doctor, so quick story for those of you who haven't heard it. As a Jewish infant under the Nazis, you can imagine the kind of first year that I had. And then when I was nearly a year old, my mother could no longer be confident that I would survive even one more day where she was living. So she gave me to a Christian woman in the street and asked her to take me away to relative safety. So I didn't see her for 5 weeks. It was an act of pure love. Can you imagine it? Well, what did I experience? A sense of abandonment. And the message I got was I wasn't wanted. Now, if you're not wanted, you know what you do? You go to medical school because they're going to want you all the time. When they're being born, when they're dying, and every time they have a crisis. But you know what? So my beeper was always on. I was always on call. Never said no to new patients because that's what I was identifying with. These traits that I'm outlining here for you here are completely addictive. Why are they addictive? Well, there's a great researcher whose work I won't mention today, but his name is Dr. Vincent Felitti. He researched childhood trauma in relationship to addiction. And he said once that it's hard to get enough of something that almost works. And addictions, whether behavior or substance related, they almost work. Temporarily, they make you feel better. So when the beeper would go, I'd say, hey, yeah, I must be, I wouldn't say consciously, but it gives me a sense of importance. Why is it addictive? Because it doesn't satiate the lack of value that you have internally. So it's a temporary hit, like heroin or alcohol or anything else. And pretty soon you have to get more and more and more. So these traits of being attractive and winning attention and measuring up to other people's expectations, these are runaway addictive. If you weren't made to feel important, then you're going to become a helper. Some of you will know this. A compulsive helper, I mean. You're always helping others, not yourself. If you weren't loved for who you were, then you'll be very charming. And you'll be charming people into loving you. But again, they're addictive, number one. And number two, they're not satisfying. So what happens then is many children in this culture, for all kinds of reasons, it doesn't have to be severe trauma like our native people experienced. Just this culture that puts so much pressure on parents and then gives them the wrong information and makes kids work for the right to be loved and to be liked and to be accepted, induces this tragic choice between authenticity versus attachment. I said choice. Is it a choice? The child is not conscious of it, and he doesn't choose it. She doesn't choose it. They don't choose it. It's where the mind automatically goes. Then that pattern becomes ingrained in your brain, in your personality, and now you're set for life to be distanced from yourself. Now, in case of terrible abuse, of course, that's even more obvious. So we can talk about the two kinds of trauma, the big T trauma, the abuse, the sexual abuse, the violence, and so on. But there's also the small T trauma of not having your needs met, and therefore you have to disconnect from yourself. Because the essence of all trauma is disconnection from yourself. So I'm going to give you a musical break here. I'm going to play you the saddest song I know. And you may have heard it before, and you know the singer. And it's supposed to be a love song, but listen to it from the point of view of authenticity versus attachment. So if you put on that piece of music now, the thing about Elvis, he doesn't just sing these songs, he actually embodies them. Whether it's the raucous joy of absolute rock freedom, or whether it's the sadness. And he had a very sad life, as you know, a very traumatic childhood, beginning with the loss of a twin right around birth or just before birth. But that sadness of any way you want me, just hold me. He's choosing attachment over authenticity. And the problem is that the adulation of the whole world could not save him from the emptiness inside. The king, Well, we're all like that in a lot of ways. And once this dynamic gets ingrained in our brains and bodies, our personalities, we're afraid to be ourselves. Why are we afraid to be ourselves? Because our child's minds identifies inauthenticity with survival and authenticity with threat. So we get into relationships we're not authentic. Women, especially, 80% of autoimmune disease is with women. Women have multiple the risk of autoimmune disease than men do. In Canada, an indigenous woman, and this is a population that never used to have autoimmune disease, never, ever, ever. But today, an indigenous woman in Canada has 6 times the risk of rheumatoid arthritis than anybody else because they're the most stressed. They're the ones who carry the heaviest burden. And this is this big medical mystery. Why do women have so much more autoimmune disease? It's very obvious because those traits that I described, they're how this patriarchal society wants women to be: self suppressed, not be angry, looking after everybody else's needs. And the New York Times, during the COVID situation, I think about a year ago, had an article with a headline, Society's Shock Absorbers, which became the title of one of the chapters in my new book. And what it showed is that women have taken on the burden of the emotional needs of their men and their children, plus they're carrying on their work, and they feel guilty because their husbands and children don't feel so good. That's why they have 80% of autoimmune disease. It's really that simple. And in the 1930s in Canada, the ratio of multiple sclerosis was gender equal. Now it is over 3 women for every man. It's got nothing to do with genetics, nothing to do in this case with diet or climate, because that hasn't changed more for one gender than the other. It has to do with the added stress that women now face and the increased isolation that as mothers and wives they face. So this loss of inauthenticity again exacts a heavy price. There's another way to look at it, which is from a spiritual point of view. There's a teacher called A.H. Almas, Almaas. Anybody know his work? Nobody? Really? Okay. You do. Great. He's one of the world's great spiritual teachers, not very flashy. In fact, rather boring to listen to, but just absolutely penetratingly brilliant. And in his view, human beings are endowed with certain essential qualities like clarity, like courage, like presence, like love, like value, innate value, and so on. But and infants are born with those, and no baby questions their own value. No baby lies there at night thinking, "Oh gosh, mom and dad are so busy. They work so hard. I better not cry right now." Even though I'm hungry and I'm wet. So babies are born with these qualities of authenticity, but they need the environment to support their development. If the parents themselves haven't located and embodied their own authenticity, they cannot possibly mirror the child's. And that lack of mirroring itself is enough for the child to shut down those qualities. And he says, wherever we shut down one of these essential qualities, we develop a hole, which we then try to fill from the outside by all kinds of ways, by being nice, by being addicted, by whatever. And here's where the larger society comes in, and I'll have to come to the end of my talk shortly. But here's where the larger society comes in, is that this is exactly the kind of person that this society wants. Somebody who doesn't think for themselves, who's not in touch with their gut feelings. I mean, would anybody vote for any politician if they were in touch with their gut feelings? Oliver Sacks was mentioned this morning in his book. The man who mistook his wife for a hat talked about witnessing a group of aphasiac patients. Aphasiacs are people who can't process language because they had a stroke in that part of the brain. And these aphasiacs are watching Ronald Reagan, the great communicator, a completely inauthentic person, totally shut down from himself, owing to terrible childhood trauma. But they were watching Reagan, the great communicator, talking on television, and these aphasiacs who did not process language were all laughing. And some of them were totally indignant. They're really indignant or they were laughing. And Oliver Sacks writes, is it that they didn't understand Reagan? Or is it that they understood him all too well? Because they saw through the words. They were looking at the body language. They were looking at the facial expressions. They were looking at the intonation of the voice. I'm telling you, you want to see politicians? Turn off the sound. Just watch their body language. You're going to see complete inauthenticity, with honorable exceptions, but very few honorable exceptions. So what I'm saying is that society itself reinforces. Now here, and let me tell you something amazing. In an ant colony, all the ants have the same genes. The worker and the warrior genetically is no different from the queen. It's the needs of society, of the ant colony, that determines whose genes are going to be turned on and off. So when you take the mother, when you take the queen out of the ant colony, there'll be a furious battle among some of the warriors, you know, and one of them or some of them will win out. Now they become the queen, and their body changes. They start ovulating, and they live longer. They become bigger, and it's the same genes, all responding to the needs of the society. Now we may think we're much more sophisticated than the ants, but let me tell you, we're very determined by what society expects of us. And in that sense, as the psychologist Eric Fromm pointed out, the family becomes the psychic agent of society. So suppressing our needs, suppressing our anger, separated from our gut feelings, allowing others to manipulate us, desperate to belong at any cost, these are the kind of people that the society wants. And a lot of people have made that observation. And then because our real needs were not met, because their real needs were not met. Therefore, we develop false needs, and this whole society functions on the catering to people's false needs. I watched a documentary about Bob Dylan, um, made when he was quite young and visiting Britain, and he's sitting in the back of a limo. Some of you may have seen this, and these two young fans come up to the back window and they say, "Give us your autograph." And Dylan, who never gave a damn about anything, said, "I don't want to give you my autograph." So you have to give us an autograph. Your autograph. No, I don't have to give you my autograph, but I need your autograph. He says, "No, you don't need it. If you needed it, I would give it to you, but you don't need it." But this society is expert at making us believe that we need things that we don't. It functions on it, and so. In his autobiography, the Catholic monk um, Thomas Merton actually writes that we live in a society whose whole policy, he wrote this in 1948, by the way, 80 years ago almost. We live in a society whose whole policy is to excite every nerve in the human body and to keep it at the highest pitch of artificial tension, to strain every human desire to the limit, and to create as many new desires and synthetic passions as possible in order to cater to them with the products of factories and printing presses and movie studios and all the rest. So that inauthenticity is what this particular culture thrives on. So that the pressure to be inauthentic isn't only and solely through the dynamic between parents and children, it's also through the pressures of the culture and the economy on us human beings. That's why it's so difficult. That's what makes it difficult. Because to be authentic, you have to undo a lifetime of programming and you have to fly in the face of the culture in which you live. Well, let me finish with this. Wade was asked about re engaging with the sacred, and he said uh, psychedelics. So that's not the only way, but certainly a powerful way. Let me tell you about my first ayahuasca experience. I After I wrote my book on addiction in the realm of hungry ghosts, I'd be speaking all over the place on addictions, and People would ask me, "What do you know about ayahuasca and the healing of addiction?" I say, "Sorry, I don't know anything about that." Next stop, next city. "Hey, what do you know about the healing of addiction and ayahuasca?" I say, "I don't know anything about it." By the fourth time, I wanted to tell the people to take a hike somewhere. But then somebody said to me, "Did you know you could actually do it here in Vancouver?" Because a Peruvian ayahuasca was coming up to lead some ceremonies. So I sat in that tent and I took this bitter brew. I don't recommend it for its taste anyway. And then the music began and I started to cry. And these were tears of pure love rolling down my cheeks. It wasn't love for anybody in particular, although that was there. It wasn't for my spouse or children or anybody else. It was just love. And I realized that was my nature. But I hadn't known that all my life. And I also realized how shut down against love I had been. Why was I shut down against love? Because when I was pure, open, and loving and vulnerable to love, I was badly hurt. My mother abandoned me, you know. So the plant experience opened up both the pain that I've been running from all my life and also the sacred love that tells you you don't have to run anywhere. You're exactly at the right place. Now, I wish I could tell you that that experience altered my life, and ever since then I've been on treading on the clouds in the presence of angels. That hasn't actually been the case, but at least it showed me the possibility. And I could talk to you at great length about how to regain or how to find or how to recognize authenticity, but I'll need to stop here. But let me tell you, that's your biggest journey and also the most important one. Thank you.